Welcome, I'm Sylvia Munoz-Schnopp, and here with KDTV and Juan Garcia, we're going to be talking a little bit more about the Christero Revolution. Now, Juan's family had an interesting position within the Christero Revolution, and I'm very happy that he could make this interview today. So with that, Juan, welcome.
Thank you, Sylvia. Good evening.
Good evening.
My pleasure to be here with you for this interview.
Thank you. Now, it was interesting that we met through a mutual friend, and you had come to a Christero Revolution presentation that I had at a local library, I think.
That is correct, yes.
And so that got you interested in finding a little bit more about your family. And so what did you discover about their involvement with the Christero Revolution?
You know, I remember things at the beginning when I actually was at your presentation at the library. You're right. I became interested in more on the subject, and I started to remember things that my dad used to tell me when I was little. So, being said that, I started to find out more, to look for more information regardless of the Christero Revolution, and as it turns out, that it was actually a big deal on the story of Mexico. You know, it's a war that took place during the time of 1927, pretty much, and I went through pretty much like to 1930 or so, and then continue under another government's or president's mandate, but it wasn't much of it after that. Well, on my side or on my family, what I can tell you is that my dad was in the army at the time that the Christero Revolution took place.
So this was the Federales, the Mexican army.
Correct, yes, and you know, it happens to happen that on the other side of my family, on my mom's side, my great-grandpa was on the other side with the Cristeros rather than with the Federales, something I didn't know, until recently, that I started to dig in the story of my family. So anyways, let me go back to my dad, to my father. He was a tough man. He passed away probably about 10 or 15 years ago. Unfortunately, I didn't know about it till recently. I found out. And but let me tell you, he was a retired Marine. He was a captain of a boat on communications. So he retired from that. He became a teacher of a school, of a university in Mexico. But on his younger years, see, back then, to be part of the militia or the army, the Federales, you couldn't unless you were a direct descendant of a person who was already in the army with the Federales. Or you actually could join in, but you would be one of the low-level soldiers.
So you couldn't necessarily attain like an officer rank or something like that, right?
Never. At that time, back then, in order for you to be an official, someone with rank, you will have to have a relative
in the
family that already had a rank. So it was sort of like something you will inherit, sort of thing.
Okay.
So my father didn't have one. He didn't have a relative. He was basically a fatherless child. He didn't have a father, only his mom. But he used to go with the Federales and polish their boots, for the living, to get money. And so he met this general in the army, and he got pity on him. He adopted him so that he will be able to join the army, the Federales.
So here's your father, who was adopted as possibly a young boy into this family, and this gentleman then who became his father was in the military and wasn't official, was
he got a rank.
Right. Okay.
Right. So at the time that all this happened, my father was, the Christero Revolution, my father was, I will say, somewhere on his 20s, early 20s possibly.
So he was a younger man.
He was in the academy. And when all this happened...
So this is the military academy.
Right.
So he was going through his training then.
Right.
Okay.
Where, the difference between officials with rank and officials with no rank is that the officials with rank will go to the academy, which was in school, basically, in the army school. And then, see, back then, on those times, the military school was like a selection where obviously only military families will be able to attend, and only those who have rank. All the low-level soldiers wouldn't be able to attend any of that school. They will be just pushed into the lines basically with almost no training, but the very, very basics, and then that's it. They will be soldiers, you know. And that was one side of the education, the military. And the other side of the education at the time was managed by the church. The church were the ones taking care of the education of the youngest ones. And,
of the kids, like elementary school,
yes,
junior high and high schools.
Definitely, definitely. They will be in charge of all the education. And that's one of the reasons why all this conflict began. Because the government took away any power they had over the education, because they thought at the moment wasn't, they just didn't want to share that power. They just wanted, you know, to be able to manage basically everything.
So this was, you're talking about the time frame right before the Christero Revolution started. So where the Catholic Church was responsible for all the teaching, for the education of the entire youth population in Mexico.
Correct.
And so there was then some changes going on where the government said, hey, no, you know, Catholic Church isn't responsible anymore.
Correct.
We are.
Right.
And so that kind of started some of the discussions or the arguments then.
Correct.
Between the Catholic population that ended up being, you know, like 90% of Mexico, and then the federal government who wanted to control some of those, the education.
Correct.
Yeah.
Not only the education, but the government decided all of a sudden that public demonstrations of
religious
nature was prohibited.
Correct.
Was completely prohibited. So they were pushed back to the church and only to the church. And also they decreed, they wrote one of the laws that they created that the church could not possess any sort of properties, like material properties, like land, like all the school churches were taken away from them.
Right, like the seminaries and the convents even.
Correct.
Were affected in Mexico.
Even the cemeteries.
Cemeteries.
Even cemeteries.
So we're talking about the time frame of maybe the mid-1920s, when Plutarco Elias Calles came into power in 1924.
Correct.
I think that's when the majority of this shift happened.
Exactly.
The education, Catholic Church couldn't own any real property. And we had also found out too that the president threw out of the country all the priests that were foreign born. So he then started to really limit the church and the power, you know, alongside then the processions. They couldn't have the processions anymore either.
Right. Well, what happened here is that the church, they decided to, and side that the conflict was getting bigger and bigger. They decided to close the churches. However, some priests, you know, they love their people. They love they call it feligreses, you know, the attendants of the church, and they wanted to still, you know, process ceremonies and even do the blessings for people who will be getting married. Yes. Something that the government didn't see with good eyes.
See, now that was something that also happened, is that the government, up until that point, the Catholic Church would record all the marriages.
Correct.
And so the government said, no, we're going to do that now. And everybody has to be married through a civil ceremony.
Correct.
And that's the only way to record a marriage then.
Right.
And so they really just flipped the whole culture upside down, where people had been accustomed to doing something and to have their kids educated by lay people, but the majority were Catholic. And so now the whole country is turned upside down with these new rules. So your father then was about 20 years old when the Christero Revolution started, and he was in the academy. He was being trained, but as an officer level.
Correct.
Right? Okay, all right. So what did so the discovery that you found out, as you know, his stature in the military community, what else did you find out about what he was responsible for?
Well, you know, one of the things I found out, and I, you know, really didn't like, is the fact that even the trainees from the academy were used to go and confront the Cristeros. So he said, or he used to say that most of the trainees at the academy, including officers, that were basically brainwashed into believing that church wasn't a good thing. Church was rather a bad thing because it would interfere with the government. But what Plutarco Elias Calles did was to come and take the power and really enforce all those changes on the Constitution that have been done. But he took a wrong path to reinforce the apply to those rules.
Right.
He was very, very violent at the time he wanted to reinforce that.
So you're talking about the time frame that's known as the Calles Law, or Ley Calles,
right,
that came into effect the middle of 1926.
Correct.
And that not only told the church what they couldn't do, but it actually then punished, it was a penal code to punish the people who would break the laws of the Constitution. And they were already anti-clerical at that point.
Correct.
And so Calles came in with full force then.
Right.
You might have also read too that he created his own church, the Church of Mexico.
Right, they did. Yes.
So not only did he just take all the power away from the Catholic Church, he then created something else for the people.
Right.
I believe he wanted to be their pope. You know, he wanted to
Very
have
much.
some kind of level of anything that they would say in their teachings on a Sunday, or anything that would be communicated out to the people. He really wanted to influence all of it, every message that would go out. Correct.
Well, I think what happened to that is you're right. What Plutarco Elias Calles wanted, he wanted to take control, entire and complete control over the people. You know, even though he was saying that he wanted the people to be free, but he rather wanted to control, you know, every single aspect of the life of every single Mexican individual. So it's true. One of the priests of the church deserted the church. So he was one of the priests of Rome, but he deserted.
Okay.
He deserted the church to start a new church in Mexico, but he was rather a puppet of Plutarco Elias Calles.
Correct.
So they wanted to keep all the power in between the walls of Mexico, and he wanted to manipulate people through this other priest. So,
interesting. So he then took somebody who had been trained at Catholic,
correct,
brought them over to his
side basically.
The Church of Mexico, which I believe still exists to this day. I passed by one of those. It looked like a typical old, like, church from the 1600s, but it was one of the Church of Mexico property.
Correct. It didn't succeed because the people just didn't.
They didn't buy into it, right?
Exactly, they didn't fall for it. So they decided to stick with the religion they knew, and especially with the priests they knew. You know, the priests they knew and they trusted.
Yes.
You know, so they started to stay with them. And that's the moment where we are looking at people, especially young people, to start not a violent confrontation with the government, but rather a democracy where they wanted to gather. Actually, they did gather.
They did boycotts, right?
Well, first, actually, they did recollect signatures of a whole bunch of people to try to change things around back the way they were. You know,
so they got people to sign a petition.
They did. They, as a matter of fact, did, and they recollected as many signatures as they were required to do that, to sign a petition. And but you know, Plutarco Elias Calles didn't do anything with that, so it didn't work for them. So what they did is they started a boycott, and that's the part where Plutarco Elias Calles got offended really bad, because it really hurt.
So they went after. So the Catholics actually went after the economic issue of Mexico.
Well, a sort of way to show Plutarco Elias Calles how many people disagreed with what his changes had been made, and it actually affected the economy of Mexico really bad. But Plutarco Elias Calles, instead of understanding or taking to understand that it was really what the people wanted, was freedom of religion. That's what they wanted. Instead of that, he decided to do things his way.
So that's when he gathered up then the military.
Well, the first, as a matter of fact, the first thing that happened is that there's, back then, it was an employee syndicate or association, and they did a protest regardless to something that didn't have anything to do with the religion, but it got planned somehow that they ended up being in one of the churches. So that's where the conflict, the violent conflict began. The people that was in the church were attacked by these other people. And so the whole entire society disagreed with it. They were pretty upset on the fact that they knew, everybody knew that it was all Plutarcho Elias plan. That they had planned for these people to do this, not boycott,
to stage this attack.
Yes, somehow. So at that point, Mexican citizens got tired of it, and they decided to take
matters into their own hands.
Right. So that's the part where the Christero Revolution army started to form, and they started to defend rather the priests that were surviving, and at that point is where Plutarcho Elias decided to kick all the priests out of Mexico. So the civilians, the citizens, decided to stand up for them and started to fight back.
Now this was your great-grandfather, so your mom's grandfather was involved as a Christero?
He was, as a matter of
And in what state, what area?
On Michoacan, actually.
Okay.
You know, this whole Christero Revolution war started like basically Guadalajara, Jalisco mainly, Jalisco,
Yes.
which is part of Guadalajara. There's Michoacan.
There had been some battles in Guanajuato and Zacatecas, but we're really talking about that central west area.
Correct.
Really where the flashpoint was Jalisco, and then there were other
groups across the nation. And but really mainly it all started in Guadalajara. And see, that's where my dad came into place. He was born and raised in Colima, next to Guadalajara.
Okay.
So when he met this general that adopted him, that was at Colima. So he started to attend military school in Guadalajara. So he was at the academy in Guadalajara when all the Christero war began. So they were actually sent out from the academy to fight Christeros.
And so you were saying that he was sent out to kind of look at the strategy of how possibly they could battle against the Christeros. He was used as kind of a brain, right, with the whole strategy of that area.
Right. But what happened is that once again, all the people that were in the military and the school, they were the brains of the army. And then all the lower class military was the ones who were sent out to fight.
And so they were sent out to fight with guns and ammunition on horseback.
Right.
The federales used all the trains in the area. I mean, they had all the transportation,
all the structure and the transportation to move around. They have not only the transportation and the weapons and the ammunition, but they also have the support of the government, which means food, which means clothing, which means
shelter, a place to
of course.
Stay.
Right. While the Christeros, they had, the only support they had was from the people, from the Mexicans, the actual Mexicans that disagree with what was going on. See, at that point we're looking at women that became active part of the revolution.
Now that's something interesting too, is that there's women that are recorded to be almost like a Florence Nightingale that would assist the Christeros if they got shot or hurt out in battle. There were others that joined their husbands to cook and wash clothes for them, like out in camp. And then there were others that I heard that actually ran ammunition and guns out to the folks in the field.
If it wasn't because of them, you know, the resistance would have lost probably a few, months, and that was it. But they contributed so much because at that point, the Federalists were pretty tough with the population. They will rob people. they will go into big farms, big ranches in Mexico, and just take, not even ask for it, just take whatever.
Take the food or whatever
take
was
the food,
there,
the cattle,
the horses,
the horses, whatever was available.
Mm-hmm.
You know, well, the Cristeros, rather to take, they were more like depending on the charity of the people of Mexico, you know. And you know, I would say that 75% of the civilians in Mexico supported them.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, they went through hunger, yes, they went through a lot, but you know, civilians did as much as they could to support them, to buy ammunition, weapons, all the kind of things.
And so when we're talking about a battle in those areas, they're rural areas outside of like the main capital of the Jalisco capital is Guadalajara. So when we're talking about the smaller villages and towns, we're really talking about people battling in the countryside. It was where they weren't in a city. They were out in the rural areas. And so I had heard that the Cristeros really had an advantage over the Federales. They knew the terrain, they were sharpshooters, and they knew how to ride horses really well.
That's true.
And so in many instances, the Cristeros would win battle after battle because the Federales, they were, you know, maybe not trained up so well. They were put on the front lines. They didn't know how to ride horses. They didn't know the area.
Terrain.
And so they were at the greatest disadvantage during this war.
That is true. Well, what happened at that point is that it became such a bloody war because a lot of civilians will die. I was just talking to my wife's aunt, and her mom, you know, my wife's mom, she lived through that too. And she used to tell her how sometimes it would be so bad that there would be blood everywhere. Like literally, you know, blood running down through the streets.
Oh my goodness.
You know, because it was so bad. And that the Federales will come over and take the women, rape them, you know, with no considerations. And take the food and, you know, just do basically whatever they wanted.
Now, when we go back to Lake Gaius then, we really understand that there wasn't, although people would be punished if they broke the law, it gave the federal government the right to kill people on the spot. I mean, there wasn't anything of hauling them into jail,
Nope.
having them assigned an attorney, you know, facing a judge or, you know, a courtroom with a jury, being heard out by if they were guilty or not, and then sentenced. It was where they were killed right there on the spot. That's pretty much what the federal government had in their power, right?
You know, the Constitution was well written, but unfortunately, as it is still, only people with money had the rights to a fair judge and a court and to a trial. Yes, poor people, if they committed a crime, you're right. The Federalists had the power to just kill them right on the spot. And what happened to for instance, to the revolutionaries, the people who actually started all the movement in a pacific way, in a very pacifist way, you know, with no violence, and they were killed like that. They were first arrested, and they will be decided to be killed. So they'll die either with a bunch of Federalists shooting them, you know, as they used to do.
Like an execution style.
Basically, or hang from a tree or from somewhere. You know, that is a lesson for anyone who wanted to follow and do the same thing. So, see, now oh my goodness, it's kind of confusing because I go back to my grandpa, and of course he lived through it, but you know, I never had a chance to talk to her, only until I was talking to my grandma from my mother's side. She's the one who told me all these things, how her dad used to battle along with the Cristeros, and it was their fate.
Yes.
Who led them. It was their fate who gave them the courage to stand up and fight. Yes,
because you know they were fighting for religious freedom, but they were also fighting for La Virgen de Guadalupe.
Right.
And so I had seen where they had actually taken banners or flags out. You know, so every time a Cristero group of men, anywhere from 10 to 40, They wouldn't fight in larger groups, and they didn't necessarily have like one key leader. They all had their own kind of generals that they would follow.
Right.
That they would carry these flags out, because that really gave the men the impetus to fight,
Right.
but also the reason why. You know, it wasn't economic. It wasn't about it was a little bit about education, because at that time then, when the government took the education system, they told the teachers, you could stay teaching, but you have to take an oath of anti-God.
Right.
And you won't be, you know, you'll be paid by the government. So many teachers then went underground,
Right.
and would teach at home. They would have like home schools and private schools,
Yes.
on the ranches, and teach the kids, but that's how they handled all of that. So backing up here is that as the men went out to battle and the women would join them too, they really had a focus of, we want our religion back.
Right, that and we were tired of all these abuses from the federals. You know, they were tired of the federals coming over and just taking their women. You know, whether if it was your wife, your daughter, or your sister, they were just tired. It was a time on the people, on the Mexican people, that they were just tired of that.
And so, you know, for to clarify this for the audience that is, you know, watching this interview and having you tell us about, you know, the family and what was going on in Mexico, when we look at the magnitude of this war actually affected all of Mexico, right? I mean, we're not just talking about Jalisco and Michoacan, we're talking about the whole country of Mexico.
You know, I was just thinking about that, and in a way, you can put it as the Crusades. When way back then in history, the Crusades took place, and it was also a religion matter. You know, and maybe the Crusades went right into history, and Mexico's revolution, war revolution, the Christero Revolution, didn't go into history, unfortunately, because our government in Mexico did all they could to bury it.
That's right. And so basically with, you know, your story and finding out a little bit more about your family, and my story started about my dad then telling me while he lived as he was a young child during the Christero Revolution. All these little stories start to pop up, and as people go back to find out a little bit more history, we won't find it in the history books.
No, unfortunately.
It's more of the stories that are told one-on-one through families, or somehow recorded in a different way, because people were maybe prevented from talking about it, but I think discouraged from talking about it. And the government has put a kibosh on a lot of the history too.
You know, when the government back then in the Christero Revolution, they declared, after making a deal with the Rome, because Rome at that point the ambassador from the United States was the mediator between the Christero Revolution and the government, as well as Rome.
So his name was Dwight Morrow, and he was the ambassador from the U.S. to Mexico.
Correct. And he was doing, and he actually did a great job on intermediating this revolution and war. And so at one point, the Mexican government dealt with Rome, thinking that Rome was the one involved in this, when they weren't. You know, this was all Mexico, all Mexicans, all civilians, all the people who wanted their religion, the free religion, and their actual freedom. You know, the exercise of the Constitution to allow people to do their own preference. You know, what democracy is all about. So at one point, Plutarcho Diaz Calles decided to, okay, well, you know, I'll deal with that, and I'll give him a little bit. You know, I'll prohibit him to do any sort of public expression of religion, but in the meantime, I'll let him go back into the church. You know, so give a little bit in, but then take a lot as well. So at that point, he dealt with, through the ambassador, the United States ambassador,
Dwight Morrow.
Dwight Morrow. And, but the people, the Mexicans, didn't know about that. You know, they still saw on the streets that priests were killed and that the federales were still killing people, so they didn't know about that. So they didn't give up.
Now, the other side too is that as the Vatican said, you know, we believe Catholic Church of Mexico, it would be best for you to close the churches because otherwise you would put everybody at risk.
Right.
Excuse me. So then they also told the priests, basically because of that, you don't have a job.
Basically.
And so the church, there are a lot of priests that went into hiding. There were a lot of priests that were killed by the federales because they had targets on their back. They had them figured out, like, you know, what they looked like, maybe who they were running with. So, you know, they'd go out and kill them. But there were a lot that actually went underground and had these churches that would have services like at 3 or 4 in the morning in a house or on a ranch, away from the federales, and people could have their sacrament of Holy Communion, worship together, but really be out and done before then the federale troops had any wind of, you know, the church going on. And I had seen some photos of some altars that had been done in, you know, houses. And but the problem is that once that happened and the federales knew there was a church that had a service that had happened there, they could actually confiscate the property as well as kill the people.
Not only that, exactly. Yeah, there's a story. I'll provide you with more details about it. But there's one place in León, Guanajuato, where there were actually people, priests, and actually some cristeros in there, and they were running a mass, you know, with the priests and all of that. And the federales knew about it. They just came down and killed everyone. That massacre was a massacre, and it was famous. As I said, I'm not quite sure where the place was, but you know, along with all the new discoveries and new researches I've been doing. And all this story, I found out about that, and it's terrible because there was a lot of people that got killed.
And so I had also read too that the Vatican, because they knew the priests were celebrating Mass not in the templos, not in the churches, that they had actually authorized the priests to shorten the Mass so that they could really just do what they needed to do, and it wouldn't be long, so that they would then protect the people and the priests.
Much risk.
Yes.
Yeah, that's true. At one point, the Vatican said, you know what, that's as much as we can do, and we're closing our churches, and we're not supporting any more masses because of the risk that, you know, the people has been put. So we are not doing it anymore. At that point, and after all the foreign priests were driven out of Mexico, and only the actual citizens, the priests that were citizens of Mexico, were left there, and the federales were actually chasing them to prevent them from doing any more masses or praying with the people. At that point, that's the point where all of them were like under the ground and started doing those masses on the houses. So even then, and even when they knew they had all this danger on their heads, they were still doing it.
They were still risking their lives.
Yes.
And so this war ends up being about 2.5 years worth.
Almost 3.
Almost 3 years. And so your mother's grandfather, who was a Cristero, did he survive?
He actually did survive. Yes, wounded and all that, but he did survive. And you know, I wish I had more details, you know, about him, but
the good thing is that he risked his life.
He did. He fought for a good cause, you know, and it was a good cause. I found this letter that I promised I was gonna send to you, and I unfortunately haven't had a chance to finish it because I've actually been working on it. And this gentleman who left his house, he went into a business trip to another town, and once he got to the other town, he found out all this about the Christero Revolution going on, and the person that he was gonna go talk to business, he had risen in arms already with his employees and all that, so he joined them into the war, into the Christero war, and he wrote his wife a letter telling her and to their kids, you know, I came in here looking for business, but I found out that our freedom and for religion and our God has been, you know, stepped on, and I can't take that. And I see all these people en masse, you know, with these priests that are risking their lives, and all I can say or do is like join them and fight for your freedom, for my kids' freedom. And I'm gonna go ahead and, you know, I don't want you to be sad, but I don't want you to be, you know, waiting for me when I might not come back.
Wow. So he was really moved by what his friend, who was in business, was doing in another town.
Of course.
And then joined the Christero army.
Right,
yeah,
right. And
yeah.
he wrote this letter to his wife, and he says right there that he actually perished. He didn't make it alive.
Wow.
But he fought. He wrote this letter to his wife, and I found this letter by chance on the internet, you know, actually, and I'll provide you with a copy of that as soon as I can.
Wow. And so most of the men, excuse me, that were in the war, I mean, some of them were as young as maybe 14, 15.
Definitely.
So they were teenagers. But most of them were like somewhere around 17, 18, 20, possibly into their 30s, right?
There was all kinds of people.
And they were, a lot of them
ages.
were farmers,
Mm-hmm.
ranchers. Maybe they had a business.
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, they were just all the people from the village or the town or their neighborhoods, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so they were not trained as military
No.
or, you know,
They
anything like that. No army, really.
No. They were fighting with sticks. They were fighting with shovels. They were fighting with...
They had huaraches on, too. I
Yes,
think they didn't
yes.
have the boots that you would need to
No.
ride horses.
The way for them to acquire the weapons they had was to defeat the Federales first, and then take their weapons, and then that was the way for them to acquire
Wow.
all the weapons.
Wow.
You know, they didn't buy any weapons. They had few weapons, all right, but you know, the best way for them to acquire more was to actually take them from the
Go into battle
Federales.
and, yeah,
Yes.
yeah, interesting.
They first started to fight with sticks, with shovels, with whatever they had, and then as soon as they will get the weapons, then use it, you know, and try to get more ammunition. So in order for them to fight and get more ammunition, they had to fight and get the ammunition first.
Oh my
So it was,
goodness.
yeah, that's the conditions they were fighting.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
So this is really an incredible event that happened in Mexican history, and unfortunately not a lot of people know about it.
And so you were born in Mexico,
In Colima.
and then came here later on,
All right.
and so this whole history was not really presented to you as how you then discovered by doing some more research.
Correct. And,
You had just known your dad was involved in the military and had a rank
right,
of an officer.
right. So
But he was really instrumental in
he
this.
was.
And then the great-grandfather too on the other
Right,
side.
on the other side, yeah.
Yeah.
More than just my great-grandfather, now my wife's aunt, mother, in other words, my wife's grandmother. And then, more relatives of my family were or lived through it. I just didn't have a chance to talk to them,
Yeah.
about it. But yeah, it somehow, what happened back then, it affected everybody's life in some way.
In some way,
In
right.
some way, one or the other. And I can tell you that now every single Mexican relative, whether if it's a great-grandpa or grandpa, they lived through it. They were there somehow.
And so it's something of importance, I believe, for the Mexicanos, whether we were born and raised here or born and raised in Mexico. It's certainly history that I believe we all need to know.
Definitely.
And we
agree
need to
with
know
you.
it personally as well, with
Mhm.
within our family.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
How would you encourage folks as you got into research? How would you encourage them to, or where do you think they should start?
Well, this is a good start. So if they're watching this, I'll encourage them to look for more. Now we have a great instrument that is the internet. Go to the internet and do a little research on Christero Revolution. Use one of those search engines that are great. Just type Christero Revolution and you will start finding a lot more than you can actually imagine. Once you start digging in, it's all kinds of information that, you're right, I mean, not school, not the government, but people have uploaded to these websites, and it's amazing, and it's all part of our history, it's all part of our heritage, something that we need to know. It wasn't just the Mexican Revolution, it was more to it than that.
Yes.
You know, and Mexican Revolution was a great, you know, event in Mexican's history. But I think it's fair enough for everyone who's got roots in Mexico to know about this and what happened. And how can this affect our future lives, whether
Correct.
we're here or we're still in Mexico.
Correct, correct. Because, you know, just a couple of things that happened to me is it was about 2007. So I was just barely coming into finishing up writing my book about, you know, my family and about my father and grandfather involved with the Christeros in Jalisco. And history kind of repeated itself while I was there.
Right.
There was a staged State of the Union address there in the Zócalo in Mexico City, but by the guy who had not won the presidential election, but still claimed that he was the rightful president. And so at the same time they're trying to broadcast the State of the Union, the bells of the cathedral in Mexico City go off. And so there was a confrontation within the church itself. And so the cardinal came back in and said, you know, this is not right, and closed the Mexico City cathedral and said, if I don't get any guarantees by the government, I'm closing all the churches in Mexico in a week. And so what I was there just because I went to a wedding for a family member.
Right.
This happened on a Sunday, so Monday's news, they were going back and showing the Christero Revolution and Plutarco Elias Calles as president. And what happened back then with the churches all being closed.
Right.
And it was as if history was repeating itself all over again.
It does.
Less than 100 years later.
Less than 100 years later.
It's just really fascinating how, you're right, we do need to know about our history, because I believe it is a freedom for families as well as it's a healing process.
Right.
Many great-grandfathers, grandfathers, even fathers risked their lives but were killed during this time.
Right.
So there were a lot of families that, you know, started to fragment because there, you know, it was an agrarian society, and they needed the men to work the fields and, you know, farm and all.
Of course.
And so when you destroyed that group within a family, it affects everybody.
Right, right. And I think, you know, as you said, it's very important, and the main reason is very important that we get educated on this matter is because this, as you said it right now, it's still happening. You know, not only on that event.
The persecution.
Not only persecution, but, you know, if you go to small towns or small villages in Mexico, this is something that's still happening. You know, it's still going on. It's an ongoing problem in Mexico because of the lack of education. You know, if we become aware of what happened on the past, then we're going to be more capable to prevent it happening in the future.
You have a point there.
So definitely, we definitely need to educate ourselves. If you know someone who doesn't know about this, tell him. You know, tell him, get him into it, get him to know what's going on, what happened before, and so that they know what can happen in the future if we don't stop it on time.
Yeah. So when we, as we look at then the end of the Christero Revolution, you know, that was with, you know, you had talked about the ambassador from the U.S. to Mexico was really instrumental in negotiating a deal. And it was between the federal government and the Catholic Church. And so do you know any more of the details about what happened at the time?
You know, what happened is this. At that point, Plutarco Elias Calles, the created, stated that there would be amnesty for all those people who fought.
As Christeros.
On the Christero side of the revolution. A lot of people were tired. They have families. They were poor. Their land was dying. Their kids were hungry. You know, they felt it. They felt it. They had to go back to their own families. Of course, they miss them so much, and you know, so they decided to put down the weapons and hand them to the army. And so what happened at this point is the army started to take note on who was the people.
Who they were.
Yes, who participated in this, and it didn't finish there. That amnesty that was supposedly happening never happened. All the people that had participated in this revolution started to be pursued, started to be chased, and many of them got killed.
And so this was even after the agreements
Yes.
to settle the disputes, to allow then the Catholic Church to reopen
Right.
for the people.
Mm-hmm.
And there wasn't going to be any more persecution, although the laws on the books didn't change.
They didn't.
The federal government and the president kind of said, well, we won't then prosecute
Right.
based on the laws. We're not changing them, but we won't prosecute.
Right.
But we'll give you as a Christero amnesty.
Right.
Just turn in your weapon and come report who you are.
Correct.
And so you're saying that the government didn't hold up their bargain of the deal.
Of course not. Of course not. And you know, they did it in a way that, you're right. I mean, they didn't change the law.
No.
They didn't change anything because they didn't want any sort of aftermark to them. Something that was there in the history that they broke the law.
Mm-hmm.
You know, on their own eyes, they didn't break the law on their own eyes. But they did. They did because they promised something verbally that they didn't follow through.
fulfill.
Exactly.
Right. And so also, too, I had heard that with the confiscation of all the religious property, you know, the churches and the buildings and the seminaries, that the church was supposed to have gotten them back. And to this day, that hasn't happened.
That hasn't happened. In fact, back in, I cannot say exactly the date, but the 1990, early 1990s, the government declared or stated that the church can only own so much land on within the church. So they got restricted even more than they were before.
Wow.
So as I'm saying, I mean, this is an ongoing issue.
Now, one of the things also is that when the rights were taken away really from the priests and the nuns, it also included that they could not vote anymore. So if they were born in Mexico, their voting rights were taken away. They couldn't vote up until 6 years ago, you know, because, or 12 years ago, because Mexico had elected Vicente Fox as president 12 years ago, and then 6 years ago, Felipe Calderon.
Right.
Right. And so with that change, I believe the priests and the nuns, for the first time in all those years since the Christero Revolution, finally had their rights, their voting rights given back to them.
Back to them, correct.
And so this was something, you know, that remarkable, but also too that they waited over 70 years to give them that right.
Mm-hmm. That is true. That unfortunately, among some other things that they were prohibited, you know, including any sort of official participation. That was including voting. But not only that, but their opinion wouldn't count whatsoever on any sort of court, for instance, a fair, you know, judgment. They didn't have that. If they were found guilty of anything, they would be just found guilty of that and then thrown into jail.
So this really is a story for not only the Latinos of here, of the U.S. or, you know, of Mexico or even broader Latino America. You know, this is a story for the world. To sit up and take notice and say, you know, there was this great big persecution of Mexico, but 90% of the people were Catholic.
If not 100.
So then the government then really pursued the majority of the people and persecuted them. And it was all about, you know, really religious freedom, but it had so many other tentacles in, you know, education and economic and all these other areas.
Right.
So it's a really important story, I believe.
It is,
and everybody to hear about and know.
Yeah, and as I said, once again, I mean, this is, you're right, this is an issue that it's not only going on in Mexico. There's so many other countries that religion is definitely not free, and people are getting killed because of that.
Yeah. So what's your hope now as you're you've gotten a few more stories here about your family? What is then your hope for possibly even your nieces and nephews or the next generation?
Well, I just hope that they do understand more of their own history, of their own Mexican heritage, and find out more about it and become proud of it. You know, that's what I hope. I really hope that our Latino community, and not just our Latino community, but all the people who have immigrated to this country, and not only this country, but all the people that are in Mexico, and you know, every single citizen, to know their heritage, to know their traditions, to know their culture, and become proud of it. And once you get to know your culture and your traditions, then you can look forward to the future and create a more enriched and a better environment. Not only for yourself, but for all those around you, especially your families.
Juan, it was a pleasure interviewing you. Thank you so much for sharing your family story and what you've discovered along the way about this Christero Revolution.
Thank you very much.
I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Well, thank you. The pleasure is mine.
Thank you.
Definitely.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.